Question Time Extra Time with Adrian Chiles.
And question time will be coming up in about 5 minutes, and with Ali Renison and George Parker. Just a quick couple of hellos. First to our extra timer, Robert Forrester, who runs a car dealership group called Vertu. Is that right? Lives in Newcastle. So how worried are you about a deal or no deal, Robert?
Well, you probably know us better as owning Bristol Street Motors, to be honest.
Oh, right, okay, yeah.
Well, I think in the short term there could be some hiccups along the way, but I think given we've waited 4 years for some clarity, we're just really after clarity now, and we will just manage our way through whatever we have to deal with.
But your worry in the short term would be just won't have cars to sell?
Oh, no, we're going to have cars to sell. I mean, the ports are fairly full of cars at the moment. There's a lot of cars knocking about, and the country's not going to be cut off forever, is it? No. There might be some slight dislocation in the short term, but the European car manufacturers that are going to want to sell cars to the British public, it's one of the largest markets in the world, never mind Europe.
Bristol Street Motors, little question. What is the original Bristol Street in Bristol Street Motors? I imagined it was in Birmingham because it's on the Bristol Road.
No,
but
it is in Bristol. It is absolutely on Bristol Road, and the original dealership is the one on Bristol Road in Birmingham.
I feel proud. Proud to be
100 years old, that
beautiful
dealership, and it's still brilliant and still doing great.
All right, great, Robert. Well, listen, watch Question Time for us, and we'll get your thoughts straight afterwards. That was Question Time with Fiona Bruce. This is Question Time Extra Time. I'm in the company of Ali Renison from the Institute of Directors, George Parker from the Financial Times, amongst others. So, what do we make of that then? That Malcolm Turnbull's a sort of a sharp-suited smarty pants, isn't he, George? Did you notice he was actually standing up at the microphone? Very dynamic. You don't see that very often on Zoom calls and the like, do you? I might try that myself.
Yeah, he was quite charismatic, wasn't he? I also noticed the little sort of curtain behind him had lots of kangaroos on it. Did you notice that as well? It was that blue curtain thing that was behind him. But no, he was very interesting. I thought he was a great guest to get on the programme, actually, wasn't he? Because he was talking about the issue of the day, the Australian-style deal that Britain might or might not be heading towards, and he seemed to think that wasn't necessarily such a great model for Britain's future relations with the EU.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. Ali, what did you make of it?
Well, I think particularly Malcolm Turnbull, it's worth interestingly noting there was a sort of sly wee dig there from Wes Streeting, the Labour MP, basically saying, it's a shame we don't have this ex-Australian Prime Minister advising the UK government, and that's a reference to the fact that actually the politician who kicked Malcolm Turnbull out, Tony Abbott, is actually currently very different. I think a lot more sort of populist kind of politician is now advising sort of the government on trade matters. So I thought he was really interesting, though, because I think he brought there's a lot of discussion about trade that I think might have actually even gone over the heads of some of the audience members, simply because we haven't been talking about things like trade for so long. But it was good to see a sort of, I thought, a nuanced take on a lot of those issues.
Well, here is the former Australian PM, Malcolm Turnbull, saying that the relationship Australia has with the EU, and we're often told everything's going to be fine because we'll get an Australia-style relationship, which means basically WTO rules. It says it's not the one that the UK would want.
We have obviously a deal with the EU on WTO terms, and there are really some very large barriers to Australian trade with Europe, which we're seeking to address as we negotiate a free trade agreement with Europe. Be careful what you wish for. I mean, Australia's relationship with the EU is not one from a trade point of view that Britain, I think, would want.
Well, it was interesting. We had from Buckland the Conservative Justice, the Justice Minister, saying that free trade is the answer to all evils, raises everyone's standards of living, and so on, Ali. But then later on, we also had Turnbull pointing out that, well, free trade often isn't possible. I mean, would Buckland agree with a free trade deal with Australia, which allowed the very cheap Australian agricultural products to come over here? Well, we probably wouldn't, would we? It's a complicated one, Ali. It's not as simple as saying free trade is the answer to everything.
Yeah, no, I mean, I thought it was ironic that I think the Justice Secretary was saying that the Prime Minister's approach to saying that sort of WTO terms, Australia-style arrangements, as Malcolm Turnbull said, it's not a deal, it's arrangements, would be less than ideal. Or rather, I would say he was saying that the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, was saying that, everything would be fine if necessary and they had to go there. And then on the sort of the same breath, the Justice Secretary is talking about free trade sort of being a wonderful thing. Well, you're basically sort of, I think, talking out of different sides of the corners of your mouth to some extent. But on the wider question, I think that, it was interesting that I think Malcolm Turnbull's point was that...
Ali's keeps getting cut off. Go on, pick up the what's the name, the baton, George. Go on.
Well, yeah, I mean, the thing, I suppose the thing about free trade deals is that generally most economists agree that if you have more trade, you have more specialization in different countries, and generally you increase everyone's standard of living generally, but the benefits aren't spread evenly, are they? That's the problem. And we were talking about tariffs a lot earlier, which of course are taxes on imports. Well, one of the problems that Malcolm Turnbull was identifying there was one of the reasons why they've had problems trading with the European Union from Australia is that the Europeans want to keep cheap Australian sheep and lamb exports out of Europe because it would undermine their own producers. Well, the same thing, of course, could happen in the case of the UK if we ever did a trade deal, for example, with America, where we're worried about cheap agricultural imports coming over here as well. So the reason countries have tariffs around their countries, tariff walls, is to protect certain sectors of their economy from, it's a political choice. And in the case of the UK, we want to protect our hill farmers and keep people farming on our mountains and hills. So, yeah, I mean, free trade is great in theory, but in practical terms, often, there are political choices made by each country to protect parts of their economy.
Let's bring in Robert Forrester, our sort of, how can I describe him, gentleman car dealer from Newcastle, whose group owns Bristol Street Motors, amongst others, I dare say. Robert, what did you make of it?
Well, I think put a bit of balance into it. Malcolm Turnbull also said he had huge confidence in Britain and that we would do brilliantly. And I think we're going to, if we go down the Australian no-deal route, we're going to have some dislocation in the short term. But I think we've got every reason to think we will come out positive in the end, in terms of the great things that we've got in this country, and we'll just find a way through it in the end. The food price thing always amazes me because, there was talk of higher food prices, but as George just said, really, I mean, world food prices are actually lower than the European Union food prices due to CAP. So I think we're going to have to restructure our economy for the reality. But the other thing is, it might be no deal for now. We might very well end up with a deal, just not on the 1st of January. Now, that's not great for business, because what business loves is certainty, not continued uncertainty. And I'd much prefer to know how we're going to import cars, what the tariffs would be, are there going to be tariffs, than continual uncertainty over the price of cars.
Ali, how does that happen then? We get a deal beyond January the 1st.
Can you repeat that, Adrian?
Yeah, how would that happen? We just heard from Robert saying, he made the point, and it might be right, that a deal, we go into this new era, 2021, without a deal, but a deal will be developed over time. Is that fanciful thinking?
I mean, it's potentially possible, and I think that speaks to the fact that you're going to have, even in a no-deal setting, probably as much, if not more, uncertainty as anything else, because, the extent to which we're going to stop negotiating with the EU, well, particularly because we have this sort of pesky Irish protocol thing that sort of has to work properly, we sort of are almost bound in to carry on engaging with the EU to a certain extent. And, investors don't necessarily like, I think in a no-deal setting, you would be having a lot more disputes and spats with the EU. They don't particularly like that. So it wouldn't be a particularly ideal setting, and I think that's where you have the longer-term effects of no deal panning out.
Let's bring in our A-level student from Belfast, Aidan O'Connor, politics A-level student. What did you think of it, Aidan?
Yeah, I thought that Julia Hartley-Brewer and Robert Buckland, particularly on that first section on Brexit, definitely seem to be looking at the trade agreements, trade deals, and that talks from a very subjective position. I thought Buckland calling for the EU to put aside ideology, it just came across as an ignorant statement, really, given the fact that the Prime Minister, as Wes Streeting said, it takes two to tango, and I thought those two in particular seemed to definitely not be looking from an objective way, like I thought Malcolm Turnbull was, who I guess as someone who's not involved, who's not, I guess not as partisan as others there, was able to look at things a bit more objectively.
Let's have a listen to the aforementioned Julie Hartley-Brewer, who said she'd rather see a no deal than accept what the EU is offering.
The difficulties ahead of getting a Brexit deal, given what the EU are offering, become very clear and very difficult to surmount. If the EU is basically saying they want to play a game of Simon Says, which is the EU says, whatever we do, you've got to follow. Here are the rules we've got, here are the regulations we've got, and if we change them in the future, you have to change them too, or we're going to punish you. Now, there is no nation state that will put up with that. If the EU is demanding we give up on those fundamental principles, then I'm afraid a deal will not be done. And if there is a cost to that, then so be it.
So, to her view in Parliament, how many share it? I mean, that's kind of the point, isn't it, George? That's the problem that Boris Johnson has got. That he's got to be mindful of the pro-Brexit wing of his party.
Yeah, he has, and Julie Hartley-Brewer was sort of putting that point of view, wasn't she, that sovereignty is the important thing about Brexit, and defending national sovereignty and our ability to set our own rules is paramount, even if it means basically that we end up imposing sanctions on ourselves, which essentially is what we will be doing if we leave the European Union without a deal. In fact, we're already doing it by leaving the customs union and the single market. The question is, how much economic pain do we want to inflict on ourselves in the interests of sovereignty? But I think Boris Johnson is less exposed now in some respects than Theresa May was when she was dealing with the right of her party, because he does have an 80-seat majority. And we also know that the Labour Party, or most of the Labour Party, will back the government with whatever deal it comes back with. So there's no question of Boris Johnson not being able to get things through Parliament. My guess is in the end that if he comes back with a deal, I think most Tory Eurosceptics actually will support it, because they want Brexit to be a success. And I think probably they would be worrying in their hearts about the idea that we leave on the transition period ends on January the 1st, we don't have a trade deal, and suddenly everything gets pretty messy quite quickly, and then people start to question the whole Brexit project. So I suspect, although some of them will be gnashing their teeth a bit, I think they'll probably go along with most of it.
It's a win to be sold, I think, to a certain extent. Although, I think we're being, there's little bits and sort of lights at the end of the tunnel as well. So, for example, we've just had this evening some reports of clarity about the fact that actually one of the ways in which that the government and the EU have agreed to mitigate the impact of the Irish arrangements they agreed last year, over that sort of prospective internal border within the UK across the Irish Sea, is that the UK is going to align with certain EU sort of standards to a certain extent on rules on agri-food. So, there are piecemeal sort of areas where we're seeing progress, and I think that points to the momentum is towards a deal. It's just that the impasses continue.
The other thing I'd just say very quickly, Adrian, was that Robert Buckland, the cabinet minister on the programme, was actually sounding a bit more positive, wasn't he, about a deal than Boris Johnson was. He's actually very pro-European, Robert Buckland, quite unusual in Boris Johnson's cabinet. But he was much more positive, I thought, about the case for a deal.
Do you not think this was inevitable, though, that we're going to get to the wire and we were all going to get jittery and he had to bring everybody with him and think there was going to be no deal? I think it was almost writable.
He could not have conceded. No one could have conceded. I mean, it is the inevitable theatre of these negotiations. Neither side could have conceded too early or even sort of announced a deal, because I think it would have seen as, too little progress. That doesn't mean that there aren't still issues where they're hugely far apart. But some of the starting, that's what happens in negotiations. Unfortunately, we just had a really short timescale imposed upon us, where people start out with these kind of positions and then they inevitably draw closer to the centre.
So to what is sovereignty then? Because even if you, as you were just saying, Ali, you agree to conform by certain EU standards and therefore that eases the negotiation along in terms of border checks or not border checks, then you have ceded that bit of sovereignty, because it's rules that you haven't a hand in making and can't have a hand in changing.
Yeah, and I think that the argument is that outside of the formal EU structures, you inevitably, if there are any rules that you are following, aligning, and there are shades of grey between this, but we won't get into them now, that you are ceding some kind of ability to influence them. But then if you look at it, I think the question is that are we viewing this in sort of starkly absolutist terms, where I'm going to give you a small technical example. So one of the big issues with the Irish Protocol is the fact that we're going to have internal declarations potentially on the internal border across the Irish Sea. We could have fixed that by, let's say, aligning to a tiny part of the EU's customs law, like Norway does, which doesn't have the reach of the EU courts. But the answer was that no, we had to be absolute about that. We weren't going to align to anything. And so I think one of the unfortunate things about a lot of this discussion has been that we haven't really had a debate about where does sort of being in step with the EU make sense and where doesn't it. We've just gone from, and I think to some extent, that's the last thing I'll say on that, is because Theresa May set out with some red lines, and yes, objectively speaking, they went a bit pink, to quote Jacob Rees-Mogg to a certain extent. And I think people felt that they had been told one thing, promised one thing, and it was inevitably moved away towards another. And I think that's informed the more absolutist approach that we have now in government.
Robert, how much sovereignty are you prepared to cede? I mean, is sovereignty important to you?
I think it is, and I think that's why a lot of people actually voted out. And this concept that we're going to be twins and every time the European Union changes rules, the British Parliament has no choice but to accept them is probably not what the people of Blythe Valley, 8 miles up the road, actually thought.
Well, what about NATO then? I mean, if somebody invades a NATO country with duty bound to go to war, I mean, if that's not ceding sovereignty, I don't know what is.
Absolutely, but British Parliament will have decided to do that and won't have bound future British Parliaments, I guess.
Okay, I want you to explain. I'm going to explain to us exactly, Aidan. This is your homework for the next 5 minutes. Is explain to us exactly what you understand by how the Irish situation resolved, and whether you've now got access to the single market in perpetuity from Northern Ireland. I don't really understand it. I don't think I ever will, but I want you to explain it. Can you do that for us, Aidan?
I'll give it a go, but
okay, excellent. Well, you'll have Ali listening as well, and she knows everything, so she'll be marking you on that subject. Okay,
he knows more than I do. At this
well,
rate.
We'll see. All right, that's Ali, George, Robert, and Aidan. We'll be back pretty shortly after the midnight news.
Question Time Extra Time with Adrian Chiles.
Welcome back with Ali Renison from the Institute of Directors, George Parker from the FT, Aidan O'Connor from Belfast, our A-level politics student of the week, and Robert Forrester, I think we find him in Newcastle, who's in charge of a big company with a chain of car dealerships. Aidan, so go on. I set you your homework. Explain to me your understanding of the rules now. For how long will everybody in Northern Ireland have access to the single market?
Well, hopefully Ali can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that the Northern Ireland will have access to the single market, but the trade-off of that is that we have to follow EU rules, and that's why really we need that regulatory border in the Irish Sea for food checks in particular. And I think the benefit, I guess, for business is that they will have that 3-month grace period, and I think 6 months for some other goods as well. Where there's not going to be tariffs and no checks between Great Britain and Northern Ireland for food, and hopefully that will give them the time they need to prepare for that.
But there is a border in the Irish Sea, which they swore blind there wouldn't be, but there now is. If there's any checks, then there's a border.
I just think it's worth remembering that there are in certain areas now the big issue is would there be a customs border, and that some people would define a customs border. Are you having different tariffs administered within your own single country, even if you're divided by an Irish Sea? The whole point is you're supposed to be uniform. There are animal checks, for example, and they're just going to expand significantly, but I think what we've seen tonight is some good news that they've reached an accord where there is going to be some kind of alignment. We don't know what exactly the details of that actually look like. Some kind of, the UK is going to unilaterally commit to following, I think, or aligning to certain kind of rules. So, but I think, the issue is that it's a complicated way of avoiding a much bigger situation in terms of a hard land border.
Just to show the complexity of that actually used car dealers and car dealers in Northern Ireland have discovered in the last week that they're not really going to be able to import a whole series of used cars from the rest of the UK into Northern Ireland because of some tax changes as a resulting of this new rules, and it's causing some consternation in Northern Ireland actually.
So have you got any branches there?
I haven't, but I've been in touch with Northern Irish dealers today, and they are quite concerned about it. They're not really they're going to be effectively priced out of the market due to the tax differences.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of unintended consequences that are arising from it, and part of the issue is that the deal that they, that it's not a blame game. It's simply to say that last year there was such a rush to make sure that we got Brexit after the the preamp got sort of basically switched from Theresa May to Boris Johnson, that there was such a push to say we're going to be out by the 31st, that there were a lot of kind of like rush jobs made to sort of on both sides, the UK and the EU, and now we're sort of cleaning up and dealing with the situation for that. And thankfully, I guess both sides have said we're going to have some grace periods here, but we're finding out with compressed timescales there are a lot of unintended consequences because of that rush job that was just alluded to. I think some of the VAT questions are actually proving to be a much bigger pain just because we have such little time to really get ready to deal with them in.
But if you just step back, sorry, if you just step back from it for a sec, it is incredible, isn't it, when you think about it? I mean, Michael Gove this week was saying there wasn't going to be a border in the Irish Sea. Well, the government's spending 350 million quid in the coming year to help people from one part of the United Kingdom, mainland Britain, trade with another part of the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland. And that's going to be an ongoing commitment as well, probably £200 million a year. So why are we spending that money if there isn't some kind of border? What exactly is it if it's not requiring 200 million quid to help people trade across it? Of course it's a border. And just going back to Aidan's brilliant explanation of what's going on, Northern Ireland, as Michael Gove himself said this week, is now in the enviable situation of being able to trade freely with the European Union single market, the biggest single market in the world. And it's ironic, isn't it, that Northern Ireland is being lauded for this brilliant position it's in, which is exactly the position the rest of the United Kingdom is in until January the 1st, when it will no longer
There's a reason, just briefly, there is a reason that a lot of, particularly in the agri-food sector, which contributes to a much bigger share of the economy in Northern Ireland than the rest of the UK, there's a lot of consternation about these changes for internal UK trade effectively because I think in terms of value, the GB market is such a big sort of share of what they draw recompense from to a certain extent. So I think it's not like I think some people would have framed some people didn't agree, but some people would have framed the famous backstop, as the best of both worlds, because under it the assumption was that you really would have easy access to both the UK market and the EU one. This one, it complicates the GB market at the expense of continued easy trade across the Irish border.
Let's look at COVID, and the question was the COVID virus doesn't have legs, walking around looking for victims. So shouldn't people be taking more personal responsibility to safeguard others? Let's just have a quick whip round the four of you. Do you think? I mean, answer the questions for yourself. Do you think people should be taking more personal responsibility to safeguard others? Let's start with Aidan. Looking around you and the youth of Belfast and others, do you think enough care is being taken?
No, I don't think that enough care has been taken by a substantial amount of the public. I wouldn't say a majority. I think the majority of people are being precautious in that. But I work in a local shop in the middle of nowhere, really, and so many of the people who come into that shop, they're not wearing masks, they're not social distancing, they have no regard for the restrictions that have been put in place, and that, of course, is going to be a spreader. And I thought that point was made well by Anand Menon as well on the panel.
OK, what about you, Ali? Do you think generally people are doing enough?
There's always going to be pockets, and I think that probably makes me think of one of the guests' sort of comments about could you even further hyper-localize sort of the response to it so that you weren't making others suffer at the sort of expense of a minority few. Obviously, that has its own limitations because I think there's a limit to how granular you can expect with the resource that it has, local councils, to be able to deal with it. But I would say that there was still, even though I wouldn't go as far as she would, I still think there was something in what Julia Hartley-Brewer said that, it's almost, the question about are people taking enough personal responsibility? Yes and no, but is it the job of the state to what extent to actually enforce that or direct that? And does it actually make a difference? I think they were quoting the Welsh case as sort of, querying about whether the second lockdown, the bar restrictions had actually made a difference. But it was interesting and I thought, but Julia Hartley-Brewer, I think, made an error when she sort of tried to argue on, is hospital capacity an issue? Of course it's an issue. I think it's the sort of unspoken white elephant in the room, which is, and I don't know if the NHS is in a more precarious situation because of its setup relative to other healthcare systems across the world. But that's clearly one of the driving issues that I think isn't talked about enough.
Where are you on this, Robert? Do you think people are doing enough?
I mean, I go around my business. I've been in Yorkshire today, and I think people are adhering to it to a very high degree. Actually, we've had very little issue in terms of people not wearing masks in showrooms. We ask them to leave pretty well if they don't wear masks. But I am really with Julie on this one. I think the lockdown, certainly the second lockdown, was based on some fairly dodgy data, which the ONS has now revised considerably and has done significant damage to mental health. I've got more mental health issues in our business of 6,000 colleagues and their families than I've ever seen. The hospital data today in terms of 160,000 people waiting over 12 months for hospital routine surgery. I mean, we're just facing an absolute mess, and the balance between COVID and non-COVID, I don't actually think we've got right.
George, I should ask you to, if you've got a view on the Kay Burley situation, where her and Beth Rigby, who you must know very well on the circuit, their political editor, and I think their northern correspondent, aren't going to be on air for a while. Have you got a view on that story?
Yeah, Beth used to be my colleague on the Financial Times, and I know her very well. So I'm very, very sorry on a personal level that she's had to step aside for 3 months, and Kay Burley for 6 months. But it's a really difficult thing, isn't it? Because as journalists, we are in the public eye, and particularly television journalists or radio journalists, because you're listening to or being seen asking politicians difficult questions. And I was watching on social media some of the clips that people have found of Beth and Kay asking politicians, why is it one rule for Dominic Cummings and one rule for everyone else, and you put yourself in a pretty precarious position, I suppose, as a journalist, if you're asking politicians those sorts of difficult questions, challenging their integrity, and then you're caught out yourself. So hopefully, I think probably a reasonable balance has been struck here, that they've all been taken off the air for a number of months, but they will come back. But I know they'll be regretting it.
But you know what annoys me? It's slightly my bête noire. So when in her statement, in Kay's statement, she said, "I have today agreed with Sky News to step back from my broadcasting role." Well, you don't agree if you're being punished for something. Do you know what I mean? If I'm sent to prison, I don't agree with the judge. Yes, I will serve 6 years at Her Majesty's pleasure. It's like Amazon and stuff. Well, there'll be a deal done. They'll agree to pay a certain amount of tax. The rest us mere mortals don't get the chance to agree to stuff, do we, George?
Yeah, well, it's like football managers, isn't it? You always leave by mutual consent,
yes,
don't you?
Exactly.
I mean, it's like you're sacked, but I think it's a bit of face covering. I think in the end they all issue quite some. The forthright apologies, actually, to their colleagues as well, because it created a lot of anger at Sky, I think, how they behaved and the publicity that the company got for that.
Now, let's just hear a bit of a dust-up between the Justice Secretary and Lord Chancellor Robert Buckland and the aforementioned Julie Hartley-Brewer over the way the public have been treated.
The messages about the end of the tunnel, the vaccine, what we still need to do in order to deal with this problem, because social distancing will be with us for a considerable period of time. All these messages, I think, actually are well understood by the majority of the British people. I trust them to do the right thing, and I know together...
You don't trust, that's a lie. I'm sorry, you do not trust the British people to do the right thing. Otherwise, you wouldn't decide who they can or cannot go to the pub with, who they can or cannot have in their home, whether they can be on their patio or not their patio, which tier they're in. It's an absolute nonsense for this government to claim that you don't want
Julia,
to be too dramatic about what people
police in everybody's home or in everybody's
policing people's homes.
We have not.
Right now, we are policing people's homes.
Well, we're recruiting thousands more as we speak.
You think if I had people from outside my immediate family, from my household, in my home tomorrow night, that I would still have my job the next day? I doubt it.
Julia, if we took your approach, then the NHS would be overwhelmed.
No, it wouldn't.
I mean, do you buy this personal liberty issue, Ali? That the infringing on people's liberties, policing them in their homes and so on. Do you see it like that?
I think it's a question of perspective. I mean, for me, the most interesting thing was actually to hear the comparisons that sort of the squabbles that you mentioned there with what's going on in Australia, where people have just inevitably accepted much more draconian restrictions, unbelievably what we would consider to be draconian restrictions. And we're arguing by contrast over sort of the fact that you can only have a certain amount of people in your homes. And I don't really think it's being heavily enforced. And yet, people get very angry when they see the police doing anything remotely kind of checking up on people. And it just reminds me that Britain has such a, I think it was sort of Robert Peel, the Prime Minister a long time ago, who sort of created this policing by consent model. Whereas, and we don't really have the heavy-handed restrictions that are enforced the same way due to various sort of different histories that other countries do, and it means that there's a big backlash, not as big in America, which I think is what some people in this country would consider to be off the scale, and people walking down streets with their AK-47s to demonstrate their personal liberty commitment. But, I think in Britain is sort of a halfway house, and I think, people are a lot less willing to deal with a second lockdown if they think that either the rules are too silly that follow it, or that the evidence isn't there. They want to be dealt with as adults. They want to see the cause and effect and how it's laid out, how you got from A to B.
Some sad news just in. Dame Barbara Windsor has died at the age of 83, best known for roles in EastEnders and the Carry On films. I'm trying to think who we got senior enough with us to for this to have some real cultural resonance.
Senior enough? I'm an American 34-year-old and I'm devastated.
Oh, okay. I'm delighted you're familiar with the work. A bit of a national icon for us.
I mean, I've seen the Carry On movies back in the day, I've seen the whole repertoire. I mean, my mother's British, so it helps. But no, it's the end of an era.
Yeah.
Wow.
George?
Well, I think for people of our generation, Adrian, it's one of those formative moments when you were younger. Was it Carry On Camping? Where
yes, I was just thinking about
where a bikini came off and there was Sid James there, sort of cackling away. I mean, she was a national treasure, wasn't she? And and had a sort of second sort of lease life as an actor on EastEnders. I mean, she was an amazing.
Resist.
Oh, I love it when a trade expert can do Dame Barbara impressions. I mean, her and Sid James just having a cackle off in those Carry On films was quite something, wasn't it? Well, listen, she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's in 2014, and that news was made public a couple of years ago. Her husband, Scott Mitchell, says she died on Thursday night at a London care home. He said the actress's final weeks were typical of how she lived a life, full of humour, drama and a fighting spirit until the end. So
I thought it brought a lot of awareness to the Alzheimer's issue, actually.
It did, yes.
I thought she was open and she spoke out about it, and her and her husband talked about it. And, I in a bizarre, very non-judgmental way, I think the age difference really brought home that kind of... It was someone who he sort of married, and to watch it completely sort of... That descent must have been... I think people saw how difficult it was. And so if any good can come out of it, it was that, she heightened the awareness about it to the wider British public that might not have been interested otherwise.
Thanks for that. That's Dame Barbara Windsor, who's died at the age of 83. Let's just finish up by talking about the sort of unsavoury scenes, we put it like that, at Millwall last weekend, where the footballers of Millwall and Colchester were booed for taking the knee in support of Black Lives Matters on Saturday at both Millwall and Colchester. And somebody asked, was enough done by the politicians and the football teams after that? Were they condemned enough? Well, let's hear what Anand Menon had to say before I come to you four from King's College. Here's his thoughts on it.
A bit of hectoring by the TV companies is a pretty small price to pay for sport at long last doing something about this. I remember as a kid watching football with my dad, and you'd hear the monkey noises, and the commentators wouldn't say a word. We were sitting there going, "You're not going to say what's going on the telly," and they wouldn't say anything. TV has a pretty sordid past when it comes to race and sport, and I think they're probably overcompensating and over-virtue signalling now, but I'd far rather that than where we came from, and it is a step in the right direction, though only a step, because recognising racism is the first step. We need to go beyond kneeling to acting.
I mean, Anand also made the point earlier, not arguing against himself, but made a slightly different point when he said the problem is he doesn't like being told to wear a poppy, told what to think, and had seen the Black Lives Matter come up on the screen all the time. I don't know. Well, Ali, as a football fan yourself, what are your thoughts on it? I mean, it's never, it looked disgraceful to me at the time. But go on, what do you think?
It's interesting because once upon a time I was dated someone who was a big Millwall supporter, so I've been there and I know what those fans are like, generally speaking. I mean, they're a pretty rowdy bunch. They speak their mind, that's for sure. I mean, it's interesting coming at it from someone who, despite being British, was raised in the States and is looking at this debate with a sort of multiplicity of perspectives. And I think there is something in Britain about we don't do things by compulsion. It's felt very strongly in this country. And obviously there's just not the same legacy of race relations, strained to say the least, that you have in this country. And so I think there's a feeling to some extent from people, it's sometimes communicated very badly and comes across as very kind of stereotypical stereotypical, but I think there's a feeling of, is it a transplanted problem, the Black Lives Matter agenda from the US to the UK? And yet, to capture what Anand was saying, it's, this is just, I think it took off in the UK. It was about police brutality in America. And then it sort of became something about discrimination writ large, and it's a very different thing to talk about in a British context. So I think people had difficulty getting to grips with it in a different way, and then it involved Churchill statues, and that took off. And I think to some extent people just don't know how to discussion about identity politics, or don't even want to go there.
Aidan, what was your reaction to it?
I thought at the time it was abysmal when they were booing the footballers kneeling, but I did think that Wes Streeting made the correct point that this hasn't, as Julia was saying, this hasn't really. She seemed to be arguing that why are we focusing on racial justice and not focusing on all these other issues? And I thought he really did make the point well that George Floyd's death did open up a conversation on racial justice, and that's where this came from, and that it's not just about going with a trend, it's about seizing, I suppose, an opportunity in a way to address this full on. And I also thought he's right to call it out for what it was, in my opinion anyway, that it was a racist response to an anti-racist protest.
George, as a football fan, I don't know whether you shared my sort of concern or wonder, if I can put it like that. I just wondered, when football came back after the first lockdown and the knee was being taken before all the games, just how would have that would have gone down in front of full stadia every week? I genuinely wondered. Some people were telling me the crowds wouldn't tolerate it. Others said the crowds would welcome it. I don't suppose we'll ever know now.
No, I shared the same thing. I mean, I think I sort of shared some of Alan Mellon's sort of concerns about politics and sport being mixed up, and I wondered initially whether the taking the knee display at the start of every match was something which was going to last maybe for a few games and then stop, and then I wondered if it carried on at some point, are some players going to stop doing it? Are the crowds going to react? And of course we saw that at the Millwall game. So I don't know. It was really unsavoury. The idea that the Millwall supporters were sort of talking to each other and having a discussion about whether taking the knee and Black Lives Matter was a political movement or not, it was fanciful in the extreme, wasn't it? I mean, it was basically a sort of a racist response to players who were showing their respect. And I don't know. It's I think Julia Hartley-Brewer's sort of comment that the fans had as much right to boo the players as the players did to take the knee. I think it was a false equivalence, to be frank, to put it mildly.
But what about she made another equivalence. Well, let's just hear what she said now about asking what would happen in the World Cup in terms of, what about other issues? Can we listen to what Julia had to say there?
I'm looking forward to those same footballers showing the same principles when, for instance, many of them will be playing for England in the Qatar World Cup. When they go to Qatar, will they be taking a knee for all the women who have no real legal rights and no violence that goes against them? Will they be taking a knee for all the gay people who are imprisoned or even executed for being gay? Why are we choosing this one horrific, terrible, terrible act of injustice and violence as the one issue that we are expecting to have a political demonstration of every single week?
But I get the sense that the knee is starting to mean all sorts of things to all different people, and not sort of bad things really. Genuinely, just means respect and justice for all.
I mean, I think literally, it's funny. My other half and I have been watching Game of Thrones, and it made me think of the now Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab making a comment that it was a bit dismissive and a bit sneering. Yes, that sort of he didn't know where this kneeling thing had come from. Maybe it was Game of Thrones, and I as an American was horrified. I found it quite patronising and dismissive, and then I realised people really just don't have the same. And people will say in Britain, you only take I think his response was you only take a knee to God and the Queen and his wife or something to that effect. And there are histories, even watching Game of Thrones, you realise how much bending the knee in sort of military conflict does mean to certain people. So I think there is some people are just talking different languages.
Robert, where are you on this?
I'm a Burnley fan.
Okay.
So I remember being on Turf Moor in the late 70s and early 80s, and it was quite horrific looking back at the culture. I think football's actually made a lot of progress. I think that the taking the knee means a lot of different things to a lot of people. And I think the Kick Out Racism campaign, I think, has been a massive success, and there's clearly things to do. I think we've just got to treat everybody as individuals and show respect. And I think the booing actually showed a lack of respect. But telling people they're wrong, we've got to educate and sort of in society bring these people forward, because I just think putting them in a lock cage and banning them from football isn't going to actually sort the problem out, just moves it.
You can't virtue. I hate that term in a way, and I can't believe I'm using it. But yeah, if you really want to take people with you and have a debate and improve things in society, that we don't want to politicize this. You have to take people with you. You can't just. I mean, even Obama said it, I think, last year. You can't completely just say, "How dare you?" and call out culture. You can't just call people out. You do have to work with them to change minds and hearts and attitudes.
Okay, let's finish by reflecting on this question. Come January, where will we be? On this date in January, what is it, the 10th today? 10th of January, well, the early hours of the 11th of January, where will we be? Well, George, you will have had hardly any Christmas at all, I wouldn't have thought. So, So in terms of Europe, what's going to have happened?
Well, I think in the end, I mean, I'm sort of appears to be a bit of a vanishing number of political correspondents who think that there will still be a Brexit deal. So I think there will be a Brexit deal. Still, that will do something to mitigate some of the chaos around the border around the beginning of January. But I'm certainly going to be working over the new year, because I think there will be sort of a number of things potentially going wrong and potential chaos at the border. So I suspect that will probably run into January. And if we start to run short of some fresh food, I'm sure there'll be a bit of a panic, and people will be looking around for people to blame. So it should be an interesting start to the new year for sure.
Robert, what do you think?
I agree. I think we will have a Brexit deal, and I think hopefully sterling will respond to the greater certainty, and I'll be in the middle of a used car sale, and I think things will be a lot different in January.
All right. You meant sterling, the currency there, didn't you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, okay. And what about you, Aidan? What do you think?
I honestly have no idea really if we're going to get a deal or not. Hopefully we do. But I think by that time I'm probably going to have to start preparing for my mock exams. So that's probably my.
You just focus on that. We'll get some fresh food to you. Just make sure you have adequate nutrition. And what are you going to do with your life when you've done your A levels and been to college or whatever you're going to do? What's your plan then?
I'm not really sure. I do want to go into politics in some way or not, in some shape or form. But I think right now, just looking, I guess quite short term, is hopefully university, and I would hope to study politics with international relations. I hope there. Brilliant.
Look, you made of the right stuff, obviously. Been a real pleasure having you on, Aidan. Thanks very much. And very briefly, Ali, you think there'll be a deal as well?
Yeah, I just wouldn't take it for granted. That's all I'd say. I think, the 60-40 split, there's a deal.
Okay, Aidan, Robert, George and Ali, thank you all very much indeed. It's time for Newscast.